The sound of a silver spoon striking the side of a crystal wine glass shouldn't sound like a gavel, sentencing a criminal, but at my family's Christmas dinner, that was exactly what it felt like. The sharp, piercing ding cut through the ambient jazz of the restaurant, silencing the table. All eyes turned to my mother. She wasn't proposing a toast to health or happiness. She was pointing her manicured finger directly at my chest, or rather at the stain on my cheap blouse that I hadn't noticed until that very second. She laughed. It wasn't a warm, maternal chuckle. It was a dry, brittle sound, like dead leaves being crushed under a boot. She looked at my father, then back at me, shaking her head with a theatrical display of pity. She asked the table, loud enough for the neighboring diners to hear, if this was really the best I could do. She asked if, after 30 years of life, after all the tuition money they had wasted on me, my biggest contribution to society was serving pasta to people who actually mattered. I felt the heat rise up my neck, burning my ears. My hands were trembling beneath the tablecloth. I gripped the heavy linen napkin, twisting the fabric around my fingers until they turned white, trying to ground myself. I looked around the table. My older brother, Marcus, the golden child, the investment banker with the smile that didn't quite reach his cold eyes, smirked. He took a sip of his Pinot Noir and muttered that someone had to wash the dishes, and maybe that was simply my ceiling in life. My father didn't even look at me. That was worse than the laughter. He was busy cutting his steak, sawing through the meat with precise, aggressive strokes. He simply sighed, a heavy exhale of disappointment that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. He commented to the air that it was embarrassing to be seen in a place like this with someone dressed like a servant. He said they should have left me at home, or better yet, left me to pick up an extra shift, since I clearly needed the tips more than I needed family time. I wanted to scream. I wanted to flip the table. I wanted to tell them that the cheap blouse was actually a vintage silk piece from a designer they couldn't pronounce. I wanted to tell them that the reason I looked tired wasn't because I was scrubbing floors, but because I had just flown in from a board meeting in Tokyo. But I did. I swallowed the lump in my throat, tasting the bitter bile of years of rejection. I sat there paralyzed by the old familiar feeling of being small, of being the mistake, the smudge on the pristine portrait of the illusion they called a family. The waiter approached our table then. He was a young man, terrified, his hands shaking as he held the water pitcher. I recognized him. His name was Leo. I had hired him 3 months ago because he had a newborn daughter and needed a second chance. He looked at me, his eyes widening in recognition. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to greet me by my title, but I shot him a sharp, desperate look. "Don't," my eyes pleaded. "Not yet." Leo hesitated, confused, but he nodded imperceptibly. He poured the water for my mother, his hand trembling slightly. My mother, she snapped at him to be careful, telling him that the suit he was almost splashing cost more than his entire education. Leo flinched. I saw the shame in his eyes, the same shame I had felt 1,000 times in this house. That was the moment. That was the spot. Watching her demean him, watching her treat a human being like furniture, something inside me hardened. The sadness evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. They thought they were dining with a failure. They had no idea they were sitting in the belly of the beast, and I was the one holding the leash. To understand why I sat there and took their abuse, you have to understand the history of the Golden family. My parents didn't just value success, they worshipped it. Appearance was their religion. If you weren't a doctor, a lawyer, or a banker, you were invisible. Growing up, I was the artist. I was the dreamer. I was the one who wanted to build things, not just manage money. And for that, I was punished. 10 years ago, the night of my high school graduation, they gave me an ultimatum. I remember it vividly. The air in the living room was stagnant, smelling of lemon polish and judgment. My father held out an envelope. It was an acceptance letter to a law school I hadn't applied to. He had pulled strings. He told me that I would go, I would become a corporate attorney, and I would marry a man from a good family. When I told them I wanted to study hospitality management, that I wanted to create experiences, that I wanted to own restaurants, my mother actually slapped me. It wasn't a hard slap, but the shock of it shattered something between us. She told me to get out. She said that if I wanted to serve people, I could go do it on the street. They cut me off. No money, no contact. Family. I left with a backpack and $200. I spent the first year sleeping on a friend's couch, working double shifts at a greasy diner. I smelled like old frying oil and despair. But I learned. I watched how the owner managed inventory. I learned how to talk to customers, how to make them feel special, even when they were eating a $5 burger. I saved every penny. I didn't buy clothes. I didn't go to parties. I worked. 5 years ago, I took a gamble. I found a failing bistro in a gentrifying neighborhood. It was a dump, infested with rats and debt. I used my savings for a down payment and took out a loan with an interest rate that was practically criminal. I slept in the storage room on a cot for 2 years. I was the chef, the waitress, the accountant, and the janitor. But it worked. The bistro became the spot, then came the second location, then the steakhouse, then the high-end fusion concept in downtown, and finally, the Obsidian Group, my holding company. Today, I own 35 premium restaurants across the state, including the very one we were sitting in right now, Luminary. Luminary was my crown jewel, Michelin-starred, reserved months in advance, a place where politicians and celebrities came to be seen. My parents had no idea. To them, I was just the daughter who disappeared and resurfaced once a year for the obligatory holiday humiliation, looking ragged because I worked 18-hour days running an empire. They assumed my silence over the years was shame. They assumed I hadn't reached out because I had failed. The truth was, I hadn't reached out because I was busy building a throne they couldn't even afford to look at. I invited them to Luminary for Christmas, not to reconnect, but to test them. A small part of me, the little girl who just wanted her dad to be proud, hoped that maybe, just maybe, if they saw me, even without knowing my success, they would treat me with basic human decency. I wanted to see if they could love the waitress as much as they would love the CEO. I looked across the table at Marcus. He was bragging about a merger that I knew for a fact had fallen through last week, because my company had outbid his firm for the commercial real estate. He was lying through his teeth, puffing up his chest, and my parents were lapping it up like kittens with cream. My mother turned her gaze back to me. She picked at her salad, lifting a leaf of arugula as if it were a dead insect. She commented on the decor of the restaurant. She said it was trying too hard. She said the lighting was too dim, probably to hide the rats. She laughed at her own joke. I took a sip of my water. It was filtered, alkaline water, served at exactly 40 degrees, just as I had mandated in the operational handbook. I wrote every detail in this room, from the velvet of the chairs to the frequency of the music, came from my mind. They were insulting my art while sitting inside it. My father cleared his throat. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. He tossed it across the table. It landed in my soup bowl, splashing broth onto the tablecloth. He told me to take it. He said maybe I could buy myself a decent haircut, or perhaps use it to tip the staff so they wouldn't look at me with such disdain. He said it was a Christmas gift, since he knew I couldn't afford to buy them anything. The $20 bill floated in the lobster bisque. I stared at it. That was the line, the final boundary. The hope that they had changed, that they possessed a shred of empathy, died in that bowl of soup. I slowly reached into the bowl. My fingers didn't tremble this time. I plucked the soggy bill out of the bisque and laid it on the white tablecloth. The orange stain spread slowly, like blood. I looked up at my father. I didn't blink. The fear was gone. The daughter was gone. The president had arrived. The $20 bill lay on the tablecloth, like a declaration of war, soaking up the lobster bisque and turning a grotesque shade of orange. I didn't wipe it up. I didn't ask for a new napkin. I just let it sit there, a wet, humiliating monument to my father's cruelty. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on, but my mother, ever the socialite, decided to break it not with an apology, but with a complaint about the atmosphere. She leaned in, whispering loudly that the service here was slippery. She pointed out that our water glasses had been empty for 3 minutes. She said it was typical of these trendy places to focus on mood lighting rather than basic competence. She looked at me with a smirk and said that perhaps I should go back to the kitchen and give them some tips, since that was my area of expertise. My brother, Marcus, chuckled. He signaled for the sommelier, snapping his fingers in the air, a gesture I strictly forbade in my employee training manuals. When the sommelier, a dignified older man named Arthur whom I had poached from a 3-star restaurant in Paris, arrived at the table, Marcus didn't even look him in the eye. He simply pointed at the wine list and demanded the 1982 Waitress. I saw Arthur hesitate. The bottle cost $6,000. He glanced at me, his eyes darting nervously to the subtle pin on my lapel, the obsidian lapel pin that only the executive board members wore. I gave him a micro nod. Let them dig, I thought. Let them dig until they hit the core of the earth. Arthur bowed and retreated. My father looked at Marcus with beaming pride. He praised Marcus for his taste, for his ability to command a room, for being a man of substance. Then he turned his cold eyes back to me. He started a story, one I had heard 1,000 times, about a cousin of ours who had found herself at 35 and finally married a dentist. He said there was still hope for me, that if I cleaned myself up and stopped playing rebel, maybe Marcus could introduce me to one of the junior associates at his firm. Someone who didn't mind a fixer-upper. I gripped my fork. The metal dug into my palm. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. They were drinking my wine, sitting in my chairs, eating food prepared by my executive chef, all while discussing how to salvage my pathetic existence. Then came the coup de grace. My mother decided she wanted to speak to the manager. She wasn't happy with the table location. She felt a draft. She wanted to be moved to the VIP section, the elevated mezzanine that overlooked the city skyline. I knew for a fact the VIP section was fully booked for a private event hosted by the mayor, an event I was supposed to be hosting before I decided to endure this dinner. She waved her hand aggressively. A floor manager, Sarah, hurried over. Sarah was new, only 2 weeks on the job. She looked terrified. My mother launched into a tirade. She said it was unacceptable that we were seated near the kitchen door. She claimed she could smell the dishwater. She demanded to be moved immediately, and she dropped the "do you know who my son is" line, gesturing to Marcus as if he were royalty. Sarah stammered. She tried to explain that the restaurant was at full capacity. She apologized profusely, but my father wasn't having it. He slammed his hand on the table, causing the silverware to jump. He raised his voice, shouting that the service was incompetent, that the staff was useless, and then, looking directly at me, he said it was no wonder I worked in this industry, because it was clearly a haven for idiots who couldn't get real jobs. The entire restaurant went quiet. Forks paused halfway to mouths. The ambient jazz seemed to stop. Every eye in the room was on us. My face felt cold, not hot, cold. The ice in my veins had frozen over completely. Marcus laughed nervously, enjoying the He told the manager that she better fetch the owner, or he would make sure this place was reviewed into oblivion. He pulled out his phone, threatening to tweet about it to his 2,000 followers. Sarah looked at me, her eyes filling with tears, pleading for help without saying a word. She didn't know who I was. I usually entered through the back during site visits, but she saw a woman who was part of this table. I didn't move. I didn't defend them. I just watched. I watched them bully a 20-year-old girl. I watched them flaunt money they didn't have compared to the capital flowing through the walls of this building. I checked my watch. It was 8:15 p.m. At 8:15 p.m., Strictly, the regional director of operations, did his rounds. The double doors to the kitchen swung open with authority. The conversation in the room didn't just resume, it shifted. A man walked out. He was 6'4", wearing a bespoke Italian suit that cost more than my parents' car. This was Julian, my right hand, the man I trusted to run the entire Eastern Seaboard division of the Obsidian Group. He didn't walk, he glided. His presence commanded absolute respect. He saw the commotion at table 12 immediately. He saw Sarah wiping her eyes. He saw my father's red, angry face, and then he saw me. He stopped dead in his tracks. My parents mistook his pause for intimidation. My father stood up, puffing out his chest, ready to berate this new challenger. He started shouting before Julian could take another step. He told Julian that his staff was incompetent, that the food was subpar, and that his daughter, pointing a jagged finger at me, could probably do a better job running this place, which was the biggest insult he could think of. Julian didn't even blink at my father. He didn't look at Mark. He didn't look at my mother. His eyes were locked on me with an intensity that was almost religious. He walked past my father as if he were a ghost. He walked past the trembling Sarah, gently touching her shoulder to dismiss her. He came to a stop directly beside my chair. The restaurant was dead silent now. My father was left standing there, mouth open, confused by being ignored. Julian turned his body so his back was to my family. He bowed. It wasn't a small, polite nod. It was a deep, formal bow from the waist, the kind you give to royalty or a head of state. He straightened up, produced a leather-bound folio from under his arm, and held it out to me with both hands. He spoke, his voice deep and projecting clearly to every corner of the silent room. He said, "Good evening, Madam President. I apologize for the interrupts. The acquisition papers for the Savoy hotel chain just came through from London. The legal team needs your signature before the markets open in Tokyo. I wouldn't have disturbed your dinner, but you marked this as priority alpha." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was a vacuum. The air left the room. My father slowly sat down, his legs hitting the chair as if his strings had been cut. My mother's fork clattered onto her plate. Marcus froze, his glass of Petrus halfway to his lips, the wine tilting dangerously. I didn't look at them. I looked at Julian. I reached out and took the folio. I opened it. The contract was there, stamped confidential with a purchase price listed in the 9 figures. I clicked my pen, a heavy Mont Blanc pen I pulled from my cheap purse. I signed the document with a flourish. I handed the folio back to Julian. "Thank you, Julian," I said, my voice calm, steady, and terrifyingly authoritative. "And Julian, the lighting in the northeast corner is off by 5%. Fix it. And tell the chef the bisque is excellent, but the plating needs more height." "At once, ma'am," Julian replied. He didn't leave. He stood at attention, waiting for further orders. I finally turned my head to look at my family. The transformation was grotesque. My father looked like he was having a stroke. His face was pale, his eyes bulging. My mother was gasping for air, her hand clutching her purse. Marcus was the first to speak. His voice cracked, a high-pitched squeak that betrayed his complete shattering. He asked, "Madam President, what is he talking about? You're a waitress." I picked up the wet, orange $20 bill from the table. I held it up between 2 fingers, letting it dangle like a dead rat. "I'm not a waitress, Marcus," I said softly. "I'm the owner, not just of this restaurant, but of the building, the block, and the holding company that just rejected your firm's application for a line of credit yesterday." I dropped the $20 bill into Marcus's wine glass. It splashed into the $6,000 vintage. "And you're sitting in my seat." My mother started to cry, not tears of joy, tears of terror. She realized, in that second, that every cruel word, every laugh, every dismissal over the last 10 years hadn't been directed at a failure. They had been directed at the person who now held their fate in her hands. Julian cleared his throat. He asked loud and clear, "Madam President, are these guests disturbing you? Security is on standby." I looked at my father, the man who had just told me I wasn't worth the cost of a meal. I looked at my mother, who had laughed at my clothes. I smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. "Actually, Julian," I said, "I think they were just leaving." The silence that hung over table 12 was no longer awkward. It was heavy, crushing, like the pressure at the bottom of the ocean. My father sputtered, his face cycling through shades of purple and gray. He tried to laugh, a desperate, hacking sound that died instantly in the quiet room. He leaned forward, his hands shaking as he tried to rearrange his features into something resembling a smile. He stammered that it was a joke. He said they were just teasing me, that it was their way of showing affection, that surely I understood their sense of humor. He tried to reach for my hand, the same hand he had refused to look at 10 minutes ago. I pulled my hand back as if his touch were corrosive. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I leaned in, matching his posture, and told him that humor requires a punchline. And the only joke I saw at this table was the assumption that they could treat people like garbage without consequences. My mother tried a different tact. The tears she had started shedding turned into a weaponized display of maternal grief. She clutched her napkin to her chest and wailed softly. She asked how I could do this to my own flesh and blood. She said they were my parents, that they had sacrificed everything for me, that this display of arrogance was unbecoming of a lady. She looked at Julian, then at the surrounding diners, playing the victim, trying to garner sympathy for the poor, elderly couple being bullied by their successful, heartless daughter. I looked at her. I saw the manipulation. I saw the gears turning. It didn't work anymore. The spell was broken. I told her that she was right about one thing. Appearance was everything. And right now they looked like trespassers. Marcus was the only one who wasn't speaking, was staring at the $20 bill, floating in his $6,000 wine. His face was pale, sweat beading on his upper lip. He was doing the math. He was realizing that the Obsidian Group I had just mentioned was the same conglomerate his firm had been desperately trying to court for the last 6 months. He realized that the rejection email he received yesterday, the one that had likely cost him his promotion, had come from my office. He looked up at me, his eyes hollow. He whispered that I had ruined him. He said the partners would find out. He said I had sabotaged his career out of spite. I stood up. The movement was sharp, final. I corrected him. I told him I didn't sabotage anything. I simply enforced a standard. I told him that my companies only do business with people of integrity. And based on his behavior tonight, berating a waiter, snapping at a sommelier, and mocking a woman he thought was poor, he didn't meet the criteria. I told him he did this to himself. I turned to Julian. I gave a small nod. Julian signaled to the shadows near the entrance. Two large men in dark suits stepped forward. They weren't bouncers. They were executive protection officers. They moved with silent, terrifying efficiency. My father stood up, outraged. He demanded to know what was happening. He shouted that he wasn't leaving until he finished his steak. He tried to pull rank, screaming that he was a paying customer. I smiled. I looked at Arthur, the sommelier. I told him to bring the check. Arthur appeared instantly with a black leather folder. He placed it gently in front of my father. My father opened it aggressively, expecting perhaps that family meant a free meal. His eyes bulged when he saw the total. The 1982 Petrus alone was $6,000. The total bill, with the chef's tasting menu they had ordered without looking at the prices, came to nearly $8,000. My father looked at me, his jaw slack. He whispered that he couldn't pay this. He said he didn't have that kind of limit on his card. He looked at me with pleading eyes. The arrogance finally stripped away, leaving just a small, cheap man. He asked me to take care of it, just this once, for old time's sake. I looked down at him. I told him that if he needed money, he could always pick up an extra shift. I heard they were hiring dishwashers at the diner down the street. I turned to Arthur and told him to process the payment. If the card declined, I told him to call the police for theft of services. I didn't wait to see the outcome. I turned my back on them. Escort them out, I said to the security team, and make sure they don't disturb the other guests on their way. As I walked toward the kitchen, leaving the dining room, I heard the commotion. I heard my father arguing about the bill. I heard my mother sobbing, and then I heard the applause. It started slow, a single clap from a table near the window, and then it spread. The diners, the people who had watched this family belittle the staff all night, started clapping. It wasn't a thunderous ovation, but a low, steady ripple of approval. I didn't look back. I walked through the kitchen doors, where the entire staff was waiting. Leo, the waiter they had humiliated, was standing there. He was smiling. He didn't say anything. He just nodded. I nodded back. 6 months later, the office was quiet, the city lights of New York twinkling below my panoramic window. I sat at my desk, reviewing the quarterly reports for the Obsidian Group. Profits were up 12%. The new hotel acquisition in London was a massive success. My assistant, a sharp young woman named Sarah, the same Sarah who had been the floor manager that night, knocked on the door. She walked in holding a tablet. She told me there was a gentleman in the lobby asking to see me. She said he didn't have an appointment, but he claimed to be family. I asked who it was. She hesitated. She said it was Marcus. She told me he looked unwell. I turned my chair to face the window. I thought about it. I thought about the years of insults. I thought about the $20 bill in the soup. I thought about the way he looked at Leah. I asked Sarah what he wanted. She said he was asking for a job. Any job. She said he had been let go from his firm shortly after the incident, when the partners found out he had insulted their biggest potential client. He had been blacklisted in the city. No reputable bank would touch. He was desperate. I looked at my reflection in the glass. I saw the woman they had tried to break. I saw the president. I told Sarah to send him away. She nodded, turning to leave, but I stopped her. Wait, I said. I opened my desk drawer. I pulled out a single, crisp $20 bill. I walked over to Sarah and handed it to her. Give him this, I said. Tell him it's a gift. Tell him maybe he can use it to buy a decent haircut, or perhaps use it to tip the staff on his way out. Sarah smiled. Genuine, knowing smile. She took the bill. I'll deliver the message personally, Madam President, she said. She closed the door. I turned back to the window, looking out at the city I had conquered. I took a sip of water. It was filtered, alkaline, and exactly 40 degrees. It tasted like victory.